War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 40, the Six-Day War. This brief war, as the title describes, lasting a scant 6 days, changed warfare forever. It comprised a heady mix of Douhet and Fuller, of blitzkrieg and air dominance, of a rapidity of forces and thought, and a complete masterclass of flexibility combined with detailed planning and an offensive spirit. It is difficult to overstate what an operational tour de force it truly was. As such, it frankly leaves me a little disinterested. Whenever swords clash and men die, there's a romantic tragedy to it. But when one side so completely dominates, it almost removes the human element to a degree which leaves some to consider conflict a sterile endeavor, bereft of the tragedy which always results. But you cannot dismiss the importance of these 6 days in June of 1967. And so, let us begin. As the 1956 Suez Crisis closed, the Straits of Tiran were open to Israeli shipping yet again, and a UN protective force deployed along the Negev-Sinai border, separating the IDF from Egyptian forces. But Nasser, having convinced the world of his magnificent victory in 1956, military facts notwithstanding, began to believe his own hype. He had forgotten the 5 days' triumph across the Sinai by the IDF only 10 years earlier. And, more importantly, King Hussein of Jordan was openly taunting him. The PLO was operating out of the West Bank, and, after Jordanian army forces had been soundly beaten by a retaliation raid from the IDF, Hussein stated that Nasser was a coward, quote, hiding behind the UN's skirts. Months later, the Soviet Union falsely reported that the Israelis were planning to attack Syria, leaving the Negev largely undefended. That same month, in May, Nasser massed his forces along the Israeli border, ordered the immediate removal of all UN protective forces, yet again closed down the Straits of Tiran, and openly declared his intent to destroy the Zionist state. Israel had relinquished control of the Sinai in 1957 on the explicit American promise that the straits would remain open, Eisenhower committing the U.S. to forcing the straits if necessary. It was an act of war, which Nasser was more than willing to engage in. 1 week later, on the 30th of May, Jordan and Egypt signed a defense pact. Iraqi forces moved into Jordan, reinforced by a headquarters element from Egypt to coordinate attacks. On the 1st of June, Israel formed a national unity government and made the decision to go to war. The Egyptian defenses on the border had been neglected due to the UN's presence, but remained formidable. They assumed the Israelis would use the same routes along the roads, and if they could control the road junctions, they could stop an Israeli advance. Israel opened the war with a massed air attack against the Egyptian Air Force on 5 June. There was no economy of force anywhere. Had the Syrians or Jordanians attacked by the air, Israel could do nothing to stop them. Audacious. They flew over the Mediterranean or Red Sea, eschewing the direct flight over the Sinai to ensure surprise. Fog of war kicked in a little as the Egyptians had shut down their own air defense radars due to Field Marshal Amer flying that day and fearing a rebellious assassination by air defense. The Israeli flight pattern skimming just above the water renders this decision an ironic footnote. There is little the air defense could have done. Using cannon fire and bombs, this opening attack was decisive. Over 300 Egyptian aircraft were lost in mere minutes, with 20 downed Israeli aircraft. Egypt's air defense network was attacked as well, rendering it effectively inoperative. Command of the air, in the most traditional sense, had been achieved, but not to open a terror bombing campaign to force capitulation, which, as noted earlier, wouldn't have worked against the Egyptian dictatorship. Rather, the ground forces, which had moved that night in radio silence, were prepared to move unopposed and unhindered to the Sinai yet again. The routes they chose were different, however. Rather than focusing on the central and southern axis of advance, they massed in the north, near the Gaza Strip, and used a mass main effort to force their way through the Sinai to the Suez. The northern route was also the shortest to the Sinai. Sharm el-Sheikh could wait. This isn't to say the Egyptians didn't put up a fight. The northern strategy exposed the IDF to the defenses of Rafah, which had a complete Egyptian division. Whenever the Israelis faced difficulties, the IDF responded with prompt, accurate bombings from the air. But once Rafah was secured, later that day, with relatively high casualties on both parts, the northern route to Suez was ready for the IDF push west. Hard fighting awaited at Al Arish, only 15 miles down the road from Rafah, which took hours to clear. But after that, the northern push saw little resistance, and a crumbling, isolated Egyptian army started to break. In the center, the defenses at Abu Agela remained. This was one area where the Israelis failed in 1956, and they intended to take it with massive force, detailed planning, and their famous paratroop commander Ariel Sharon, now leading the 38th Armored Division, tasked with taking down the defenses. Each side had a division, but the Egyptians were in the nominal defense. Of course, the initial detailed plan went to hell after the first advance ran into an unknown minefield. Sharon tried a different approach in the afternoon, but it too was halted by Egyptian fire. But the IDF now had a good idea of the defensive capabilities and decided to wait until nightfall to attempt a penetration and surround the defending Egyptians for an attack at midnight. Under cover of heavy artillery fire, 6,000 shells were fired in less than 20 minutes. The tanks were in position and the IDF infantry penetrated the trenches and bunkers in brutal close combat fighting in the pitch dark of the early morning. As dawn broke, Israeli heavy Centurion tanks attacked from the east and Sherman tanks swooped in from behind, surrounding the defending Egyptians with armor and infantry. By noon on the 6th, Abu Agela fell, with 40 IDF dead and an estimated 2,000 dead Egyptians. The Egyptians had bet hard on Abu Agela holding up the IDF. When Amir heard of its fall, he ordered all Egyptian forces to immediately retreat to the Suez. In the panic to save their own lives, and with no retreat planning, all equipment was abandoned. There was no command and control, every man for himself, and leadership was completely vacant. This panicked order by Field Marshal Amir did more to win the Sinai for the IDF than any tactical victory. By the 8th of June, the entire Sinai was under IDF control, to include the east bank of the Suez Canal. The IDF initially wanted to avoid taking the Gaza Strip, remembering the hard fighting from 56 and 48. But after Arabs attacked settlements in the Negev Desert, the IDF Chief of Staff and future Prime Minister overrode the Defense Minister Moshe Dayan's orders and attacked. The fighting was just as brutal as previously and required an additional parachute brigade, but Gaza City and the rest of the Strip fell on the 6th. The IDF and Egyptians competed in a foot and vehicle race to see who could get to the Suez first. Neither were interested in fighting each other at that moment. By and large, the Israelis won the race. They would bypass Egyptian units and engage them with forces dropped off at key passes. The abandoned Egyptian forces were slaughtered, some by friendly fire, some by IDF defending the passes, some by simple thirst or exposure to the brutal June sun in the desert. The Israeli Navy sent some missile boats to probe the Egyptian defenses at Sharm el-Sheikh and diverted paratroopers to land directly there as most of the Egyptian forces had abandoned their positions. On 7 June, Sharm el-Sheikh was in Israeli hands and the Straits of Tiran opened. In just 2 days, the Egyptian military was comprehensively destroyed. The Israeli government was focused on Egypt. They frankly didn't want to tangle with Jordan's Western-trained and equipped army. The Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol had directly told King Hussein that they would not attack the Jordanians and to, quote, stay out of the war. However, and unknown to Eshkol, Nasser had told Hussein that the Israeli Air Armada had been completely wiped out and Egypt was advancing through the Negev. Hussein was desperate to not be seen as having avoided the decisive victory over the Zionists and began shelling Israeli villages in the Jewish suburbs of West Jerusalem. The indiscriminate shelling killed and wounded over 1,000 Israeli civilians and damaged or destroyed about the same number of buildings. Jordanian and Iraqi aircraft began bombing villages as well. Initially, Israel's response was limited to attacking Jordanian airfields. Then long-range guided missiles the French had supplied the Israelis were used against Jordanian positions, but no ground excursion. But by the afternoon of the 5th, Jordanian forces occupied the UN headquarters, from which they began firing into the Jewish area of Abu Tor with mortars and recoilless rifles. A reserve battalion was ordered to take the UN headquarters. The UN commander, by the odd name of Odd Bull, told the Israelis to not fire their weapons, lying that the Jordanians had abandoned their positions. The ensuing brutal fight saw almost all of the Israelis wounded or killed, but having succeeded, forcing the Egyptians back to Bethlehem. The Israeli commander, Lieutenant Colonel Dreitzen, was reportedly wounded 3 times during the assault. The short-lived ceasefire in the center was over, and the Israelis moved to encircle all of Jerusalem. The fighting for the defensive positions surrounding Israeli-held West Jerusalem was a brutal close-combat infantry affair. The Jordanian forces generally defended well, but once their defenses were penetrated or surrounded, surrendered quickly or broke and retreated. These fights, due to the urban terrain, nullified the Israeli advantage in the air. The Jordanian attempts to reinforce in and around Jerusalem, however, were fully exposed to Israeli Air Force attacks. The Jordanians, not realizing the IDF hadn't been destroyed earlier, lost multiple brigades attempting to shore up their defenses. With Israeli total command of the air, and having penetrated the stout initial defenses only one day into the battle, King Hussein ordered the complete withdrawal of all Jordanian forces to the east bank of the River Jordan. Up till now, fearing international pressure would force Israel, again, to relinquish what it had conquered, they had deferred from attacking the old city. Both forces were highly trained, but unquestionably, the Israelis were better motivated to retake their ancient capital. But, with the Jordanians in a complete rout, and the UN talking about a ceasefire, Dayan, without approval from the government, ordered his paratroopers to seize the old city and reclaim the Temple Mount. They faced little resistance. The Jordanians fought a spirited defense at Jenin, but were ultimately defeated. The IDF took Hebron and Bethlehem without a fight. King Hussein feared that his dream of unifying the east and west bank of the Jordan under one flag would become a nightmare, that this flag would be the blue and white Magen David. He organized defenses against a feared IDF attack across the river to secure his capital at Amman. By 7 June, the entire West Bank was under IDF control, with only isolated and largely impotent Jordanian forces remaining. Hundreds of thousands of Arab civilians raced the Jordanian military to see who could retreat the fastest across the Jordan River. The Syrians, whose military had been destroyed by countless coups and counter-coups, had largely stayed out of the fight, and for good reason. However, yet again, Nasser's lies of crushing the IDF and marching to Tel Aviv brought Syria into the war. For years, the Syrians had used the commanding altitude of the Golan Heights to shell, mortar, and attack Israeli farms in the northern Galilee. While Israel was focused on the Egyptians in the Sinai, they were ready and wanting to remove this annoyance forever. The Syrians gave them the excuse when Syrian jets and artillery attacked. Many of these attacking jets were shot down by IDF fighters, which Nasser had sworn had already been destroyed. Having completely wiped out the Egyptian Air Force on the morning of the 5th, the evening of the 5th, the IDF focused on the Syrian Air Force, who lost 2/3 of its entire fleet in minutes. Those that survived retreated deep into Syria, out of range of IDF fighters, but incapable of taking part in the war. Syria realized Nasser had lied, but too late. The IDF had cleared out the Sinai and West Bank, and Syria stood alone against a euphoric IDF riding the momentum of victory after victory. This isn't to say the IDF didn't respect the prospect of fighting up the 500-meter slopes of the exposed Golan Heights. Dayan again expressed pessimism, while the uniformed commanders were optimistic at the prospects for a quick victory. Early on the morning of the 9th, the Syrians begged for a ceasefire, which the Israelis ignored only hours later to attack and seize the Golan Heights. As noted, this was an exceedingly tough battle, fighting uphill against concrete bunkers and trenches. The casualties reflected the difficulty. IDF losses, especially amongst its officers, were the highest out of the three fronts. Unlike the Egyptians and Jordanians, the Syrians had defense in depth, and even after their first-line defenses were captured, they continued to resist. But by the next morning, the Syrians were, like the Egyptians and Jordanians before them, in full retreat. The Syrians compounded this by announcing the fall of their army headquarters at Quneitra 3 hours before it was actually captured. This was an attempt to make the UN pressure Israel to accept a ceasefire, but all it actually did was cause any remaining Syrian defenders to run for their lives. The relatively small Golan Heights took longer to control than either the West Bank or entire Sinai Desert. But by the morning of the 10th of June, in only 6 days, Israel had crushed its Arab neighbors. The Israeli Air Force had mastered both the detailed planning and technical precision for delivering command of the air, as well as flexibility in supporting advancing ground forces. The Israeli Armor Division showed all the offensive spirit of 1956, but had alleviated their previous deficiencies in logistics and maintenance. And the IDF infantry proved themselves the equal of any in the world in attacking dug-in defenses against superior forces. The Arabs, and Nasser in particular, struggled to find their footing. Syria and Jordan could, with strong justification, blame Nasser's lies into forcing them into a fight they didn't want and were certainly unprepared for. Nasser immediately resigned, but then reclaimed his role as dictator of Egypt through what appeared to be genuine public demand. He proposed that the Israeli jets were actually American jets, and that the attack was actually done by America. This narrative still exists in some Arab circles today. The most important lesson was that by attacking first, Israel had seized the initiative and fought against a stronger opponent on their terms in nearly every instance. But in doing so, Nasser was at least able to frame himself, despite his closure of the Straits of Tiran and expelling of the UN peacekeeping forces, as the victim. The victory in 1967 did not bring long-term peace, however, and in only 6 years, the fight would be on again in the Yom Kippur War, which we'll go over next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.